Hello, Burnsville High School. This is Miss Staffa, and we are here today to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. I have a little Bessie Smith playing in the background. Hopefully it's not too distracting, but she is one of the most well-known musicians of the Harlem Renaissance. Our two objectives are to first identify the cause and the results of the migration of African Americans to northern cities in the early 1900s, and then second, to describe the outburst of African American artistic activity that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. So those are the two things that you should get out of the video today. So here we go. The Great Migration, going along with the first objective there, was the fact that many African Americans in this time period in the 1920s were moving from the South up to the North. And it was for a couple different reasons that we'll talk about in just a second. But between 1910 and 1920, hundreds and thousands of African Americans moved north. Primarily it was so they could find jobs. There were jobs in the cities, there were jobs in the factories, and as much as immigrants were coming over, African Americans were looking for opportunities to have jobs in other situations other than on the farm and with agriculture in the South. So they sought jobs in cities. Secondly, there was racial violence in the South. It was, as we saw, with different conversations about lynching and the treatment of African Americans in the South, and in the North for that matter. But there was also economic discrimination. So while legally they were quote-unquote equal, there still was a lot of actions that were happening in society that really did not allow them to be economically equal, on top of all the social issues where they weren't equal. And then also between 1915 and 1916, there were droughts and floods in the southern plantations, and it brought the destruction of cotton crops. And the boll weevil was a little insect that destroyed cotton crops. And so on top of the fact that there was economic and racial discrimination, they now were out of jobs in the one place where they had them in the past, and that was on the plantation, primarily cotton plantations. And Zora Neale Hurston, who was one of the famous Harlem Renaissance poets, wrote about this departure from these African Americans to the North. And this is actually right from your textbook. She wrote, "Some said goodbye cheerfully, others fearfully, with terrors of known dangers in their mouths. Others in their eagerness for distance said nothing. The daybreak found them gone. The wind said north." So that is from a poem that she wrote called Sorrow's Kitchen. So there was a huge influx of African Americans to the North at the time. And as a result of this, by the end of the 1920s, 40% of African Americans lived in cities. So that's a huge difference from, just maybe 20, 30, 50 years before that, where the majority of African Americans were in fact in the South and leading an agricultural existence. And as they moved north, it was not going to be easy. There was a lot of discrimination that was in the North, and now they were taking over, African Americans were coming and taking over quote-unquote white jobs. So there was a lot of racial discrimination and violence that erupted as a result of that in the North, including the lynchings that we've talked about in Duluth. And just in one summer in 1919, there were 25 race riots that were a very big deal, and it was kind of handicapping our country, I guess you could say. Out of these race riots, a number of different organizations kind of came to the forefront and reacted. And the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, decided that they were going to protest racial violence. And this was done under the leadership of a couple different people. One of them is W.E.B. Du Bois, who you see pictured there. And they also pushed for anti-lynching legislation. So they wanted it to be made illegal to lynch someone without, period, and to make it feasible for African Americans to have a fighting chance in court and while on trial. W.E.B. Du Bois is the voice for the NAACP, and he wrote for a newspaper called The Crisis. He edited that newspaper, and he wrote as African Americans were coming back from war, because they fought in World War I, for America, and they're not seen as equal when they get home, but we can put them out for them to die for our country, and then turn around and treat them as chattel back at home. But he wrote in his newspaper, on behalf of the African Americans that were coming back from war, we return from fighting, we return fighting. And that was kind of his message to people, that we weren't going to just kind of sit by the wayside and let white Americans kind of trample all over us. Another person who kind of came to the forefront is Marcus Garvey. And a lot of African Americans, agreed with the NAACP, but some wanted to have a more radical approach to things. And so Marcus Garvey, he was a Jamaican immigrant who wanted blacks to be separatists. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and under this association wanted to make separate societies for African Americans, and recruit followers and push this idea that we should be separate. And the message that he was sending was an idea of black pride. So he wanted to promote African Americans, but not as subservience to whites, not as equal to whites, but perhaps in some cases even better than whites. There was a message of pride there. And he promoted the sponsorship of African American businesses, and encouraged people, African Americans, to purchase things from these African American businesses so as to keep kind of the following going. He set up grocery stores, tailor shops, newspapers, all different kinds of things to kind of help fuel the African American group. And he also wanted people to, African Americans, to form an independent nation, and wanted to return people to Africa. So he set up a shipping, not a shipping line, but like it wasn't a cruise boat either. It was kind of I don't even know what you want to call it, a steamship that would bring African Americans back to Africa, and it went bankrupt. So that didn't really work out for him. He had a lot of, at the peak, there was probably 500,000 African Americans that supported him. But he was put in jail for mail fraud, and then he was deported to Jamaica, and everything just kind of fell apart after that. So Marcus Garvey, not as successful as other African American leaders would be, but sure gave it a whirl. In the 1920s, Harlem, as one of the kind of subsections of New York City, became this culmination of the black community, and it was the largest urban black community in the world, and there was 330,000 plus African Americans that were living in Harlem. In addition to this, there were white Southerners, people from West Indies, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Haitians who also lived in Harlem. So it certainly wasn't primarily just an African American thing. Now there's Spanish Harlem, but it was kind of a culmination of all these different cultures coming together that really brought the Harlem Renaissance into society. Renaissance, the word Renaissance means rebirth, and so as African Americans were moving north, and people were starting to kind of take pride and have this Marcus Garvey inspired pride in who they are, the Renaissance kind of began to flourish in Harlem. And it was partially a literary movement, so there was a lot of stories and poems that came out of this time period, and that consisted of well-educated, mostly middle-class African Americans. There would be aspects of it that celebrated African heritage and explored what it meant to be African in America. And so there was a lot of writing that went on about identity and culture and all those kinds of things. And Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston were kind of the top poets or writers, African-American writers of the Harlem Renaissance. There also was a huge Renaissance in music, which is what you're hearing in the background. There's a little Bessie Smith, and she's coupled with Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. So jazz was a big feature in the Harlem Renaissance, and in a big part of, or portion of, the Harlem Renaissance. So while a lot of it focused on literary stuff, music was certainly involved as well. And that is the end. What we're going to do in class is talk a little bit about Harlem Renaissance poets and look at some poetry from the Renaissance. Okay, I hope you enjoyed.